أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So to continue, let's press the button. Okay, here we go. So how have you been navigating challenges in your lives? What is helping and what is not? What would you like to see from yourselves and from other people in developing an atmosphere essentially that is going to be helpful and to everyone's growth, to develop everyone, to help nurture everyone's growth and development essentially, and to make it a very positive as opposed to a toxic environment? What are some things that you're doing or you would like for people to do or for yourself to do? Any ideas on that? So again, our thing that we're talking about is making sure that whatever goals that you have in mind do align with your with the capital T truths. So you want to make sure that you don't have these fantasies in your head that things are going to happen a certain way when the reality does not work that way, right? And I want to differentiate. I want to differentiate a little bit between ambitions in things, for example, that are realistic. For example, I'm going to use Elon Musk as an example, right? So his example of sustainable energy, right? I'm not talking about his business practices or how he might be with his company employees and so on and stuff, right? That's a different topic. But I'm just talking about like the idea of vision, right? Um, if you have a vision of a sustainable future in the sense of sustainable energy, for example, um, or by using renewable energies, right, to make sure that that happens, that is something that is feasible. That it's been something that has been feasible for a long time. It was just a matter of are people going to be ready and willing to go with that route, right? And as technology has as things have advanced, as research and development has continued to progress, right, what has happened is that people realized how to make sustainable energy or renewable energy more accessible to everyone. So the cost of making solar panels, for example, is a lot less than it was back in the day, right? The same thing with computers, for example, it's a lot less than it was before. And so this is how technology works. So this kind of, even though in our time, it may seem that it's not something that's like very near in the future, right? It's still possible in this case. So the capital T truth is that it is still possible. Flying cars, for example, are still possible, right? They tested a while back a car. So the idea is that these things are possible. Even hoverboards, for example, are like by hoverboards I mean like hovercrafts, right? Something that sort of like floats in the air. These things are possible um, in terms of like physics and so on. These things are possible. Are they going to happen tomorrow, a year from now, or whenever? That's something that may not be immediate, right? In terms of the vision planning and so on, but it is definitely something that is possible, right? When it comes to things like, for example, um, like uh, like we want people to be completely okay with oppression, right? That may not align with capital T truth. So that's something that we need to sort of discard from our thoughts of what capital T truths are. People are not going to be happy when they're being oppressed, right? There might be exceptional cases and stuff, but even them, they have problems associated with them, right? For example, there's a syndrome when a person uh, who might be like who is then this person is in has been abducted, and they sort of start having like a certain kind of um, relationship or like a feeling towards their captor, right? So that's something um, that is very particular in a particular context, and it's not something that's necessarily good, right? It's not something necessarily healthy, right? So that's important to understand over here. That so capital T truths, you want to make sure that you understand the difference between something that is possible, right, and realistic, versus even if it's not immediately realistic, right, versus something that is impossible. Also, when it comes to your truths, your capital T truth could also be about the time it takes to achieve a certain goal. So what is not feasible necessarily is that to sit down and imagine and think that today, like right now in the next hour, everyone's going to be totally on board in terms of going solar, right? that's not something necessarily that's going to happen tonight. So the how quickly that your goal is going to be achieved, that your vision is going to be realized, that's something that also has a capital T associated with it, and that's where we need to be realistic about things like that. So there's a difference between is it possible versus how quickly is it going to happen, right? So each of those aspects have their own capital truths assigned to them. So just understand that when you focus on transformation, that your capital T truths align with different aspects of the thing that you're looking at. So that the capital T truths of the different aspects of the concept that you're looking at, or the kind of transformation that you're expecting or hoping for and stuff, so that you don't get overwhelmed and frustrated when things don't go the way that you wanted to because you thought the capital T truths are a certain way. Okay. And we talked about the end vision has to be clear. So now let's continue talking about when things go wrong, right? So we've spoken about various things that happened throughout history, and we talked about already some things that were positive, some things that worked out really nicely, and how it helped people sort of become empowered, and it kept them positive and so on. And that's some of the things that you guys were mentioning in our discussion portion earlier today, or in the earlier part of this. Now, this is what we're focusing on when things go wrong, right? So in this context, we've spoken a little bit about some historic events, some independence events, some oppression events. We've talked about genocides and massacres and things like that, right? And ethnic cleansing, for example, in the case of the Bosnian, in the case of the Bosnians, in the case of the Bosniaks, and we. What's that?
I'm going to give you your 15 minutes.
Okay. So let's continue talking about slavery and the African American community, and how that also it falls into the larger scope of the third world country exploitation. And I'm going to explain why I put that in quotation marks, third world countries. Okay, so on the concept of slavery and blacks, right, the black community, there are two types of two groups of people in the community itself, right? One of them is are the descendants of slaves. These are Africans that are descendants of slaves. So this is a community of people within the black community. Okay, so they can trace back their roots to specific slaves that came over here, that were imported over here. Even though the word imported sounds bad, but this is how they were brought in, right? And then there's another community, which are people that have come from Africa on their own choices, right? So that's still black community, right? And they grew up over here. They might be second, third, fourth generation, but they've sort of they grew up over here after that. But they came here by their own choice. Okay, so there are two groups of people within the black community. Now, when it comes to the slavery, right? In the earlier, in like hundreds of years ago, right? I'm gonna jump a little bit back. Hundreds of years ago, the European colonial powers, they went into different places, and they considered the people that they were sort of like going to as very primitive and very barbaric, and they were also taking them, and they were enslaving them, and they were bringing them, and they were utilizing them for labor and so on, right? That's the kind of thing that this is the mindset that they had when they were looking at these people that had lesser when it comes to their education and development of their countries and so on, and the political systems and the economic system and so on. They were very comparatively speaking, they were a lot lower in terms of all these aspects, right? And so they were seen as very primitive, very barbaric and so on. And so people would abduct them and bring them over to the different European countries, and that's where they were continuing to be traded as slaves. Now, as this continued happening, this was specifically focused on black people, right? Whereas slavery in the time of the Prophet ﷺ was just anybody that was, in the case of, like, for example, war, right? If you were, for example, fighting another group of people, and then you won over them, right? So all those people would be your captives, and you would take them as slaves, right? Or you could free them if you wanted to. Now, when it comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and in the examples of, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions certain things, so when it comes to expiation and so on, the freedom, giving freedom to your slaves, was considered as a very noble thing to do. In fact, it was one of the most rewarding things that you could do. And so some of the saying some of the du'as, for example, or doing certain actions, have reward equal to, or it's like it's similar to freeing a slave. Some of these actions are so high in terms of reward that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compares them, or the Prophet compares them to freeing a slave. Or you might commit a very big sin, right? And the expiation of that might be to free a slave, for example, right? And so this concept in Islam was that, okay, although this is happening, this is the norm, that when people fight, the winners take over the losers, and they can imprison them, and they can also enslave them, and so on. That was the thing. So it wasn't necessarily like, one particular race over another particular race. It was more like, okay, we had, a fight, and whoever won got the armors and the property and everything that belonged to the people that were defeated, essentially, right? So that was it. There was an idea of overcoming another group of people and like pretty much owning their stuff, right? That was that. Now in this case right here, it was specifically targeted to black people. In the case of the European slavery, which is very different than what was in Islam, or not in Islam, like in the context of Islam, meaning when Islam came, what was going on predominantly, what was happening then, that was a very different slavery than what we have today. So that slavery in Islam, in that slavery, you had to make sure that you fed your slaves sort of like the same way that you're feeding yourself, your family. You also had to make sure that their clothing is good and stuff and so on. So you had to treat them as essentially a member of your family, right? And so they were working under you. But at the same time, they could also buy their freedom out there. They could have a contract with you so that they could get freedom out of that. So they would have contract where the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, there's a hadith where he mentioned ثلاثة حق على الله عز وجل عونهم, that there's three that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has it's upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to assist them, to help them, right? One of them is a person who's intending to seek marriage, right? So if a person wants to get married because they're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has this this person has a right on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he must help them because the person is doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah is going to help them, and it's binding upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has sort of assumed it for himself, that it is binding on him, that if somebody tries to do something that he asked them to do, that he has to help them in that thing that they're trying to do, right? Okay, so one of those three groups is this person, but another person is a person who wants to get his freedom. So he is a slave, but he wants to get manumitted for him. He wants to be freed. So what he does is he enters into a contract with his slave owner, and then in that contract, they decide how they're going to be freed, and then that's it, right? And as you know, one of the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, one of them, I'm gonna leave this for you guys to figure out who this person was, but the Prophet ﷺ, helped him in his contract of freedom by planting a certain number of date palm trees, and yeah. So if you know that person, you can mention it in the chat. Otherwise, this is your homework to figure out who this Sahabi was, radiallahu anhu. So anyways, this was how the slavery was back then. But then the slavery over here, the European slavery, this is very different, because in this case you were treating them as subhuman, right? And there was like no way to really buy your freedom, because you were the property of somebody else, so you couldn't do anything to get your freedom. In fact, the idea was to keep as many slaves as possible, because that was like a way to get your land worked on more and stuff, and you had like a class. You had this idea of I have this many slaves, I have this much property, I can do this and this and this. And so there's like an idea of success, or yeah, the idea of success in this area. So what happened in that case is that people started seeing blacks as subhuman. In fact, Abraham Lincoln and others, they have these comments that are indicating that these people felt that like it was impossible for blacks and whites to live together, because the blacks were a different group of people, and they were like they were inferior, subordinate to the whites, and that it would be very difficult for them to live in a harmonious society, right, together in harmony. And so for example, Abraham Lincoln had this proposal that these people should be given sort of like an island or something where they would all go to, and then they can take care of themselves and stuff, and that's that. So you should still treat them as a human being, but these are inferior in terms of human beings. They're not the same human being as everyone else, right? And as you know, we talked about it a little bit before, where in Nazi Germany, for example, there were many people, and the Nazi doctors and stuff, right? They were experimenting and so on. What they would do is also try to figure out the shape and size and so on of Jews, for example, and others, because it was Jews plus others that were tortured and killed and so on. So they would measure them and try to figure out some way to justify scientific racism, right? And the same happened when it came um, black slaves and stuff, right? So the idea was that they would try to justify their treatment of blacks by trying to prove scientifically that they are inferior as like, you know, as humans compared to themselves, compared to the whites. And this idea right here is what permeated across most presidents in American history. Very, very few people may have sort of like stood against racism, but up until very recently, pretty much all the presidents had this idea of that blacks are inferior. Okay, very few exceptions, but the general rule was that most presidents had this understanding that blacks are inferior. And so you see this happening across the world. Why? Because going back to the colonial era, right, the colonial powers, when they were going and occupying places and stuff, right, and then they were also having this slave trade all over the world, what was happening is that they were also they had the same mindset that, you know, black people are like this, and so this sort of permeated across all areas. Now, the very interesting point over here is that when these Europeans came to America, right, and they wanted to set up a state where they would have their own like freedom and stuff, and they wouldn't be persecuted like they were persecuted in England, right? When they came over here, they set up all this stuff. So they felt that they were persecuted and they were sort of treated in an unjust way. But then what they ended up doing is that they ended up continuing the slave trade themselves. So even though they felt like they were being mistreated by people in a certain way, and that you see that in the Declaration of Independence, there's very strong language towards this effect, right? That they were saying that this is how we were treated, and this is how this is wrong, and everyone has these rights and so on and stuff, right? But somehow or another, they felt like their treatment of, you know, the way they were treated was different than the way they were treating slaves. So that's a very interesting thing over here. There's like an irony over here, like whatever you're running away from, and the same things that you're saying that apply to you, you forgot to apply them on your own when it came to like your treatment of slaves, right? And so this sort of permeated onwards until it started becoming a very big thing. And that's why in the world today, people with darker skin naturally tend to be seen as inferior, right? Because this sort of like, you know, went on for a very long time, and it became spread out all over the world, not just, you know, at the United States, but it was also in other places. And so that impact, the effect that it had, is that people considered, you know, like, and I was mentioning before that, you know, people used to consider whiteness as a sign of like upper class, because then you're not exposed to the sun, and you're like, you know, you have the means to stay at home and not get impacted by the sun. Whereas if you didn't have the means, you'd have to work hard and stuff, but then you have to be outside in the sun, and your skin would get like really dark and stuff like that. And so this idea of like, you know, putting certain sort of like makeup and creams and things like that, even if they were poisonous, they would put them in there, and that would make them, that would try to make their skins appear whiter than they were, right? And so this was the idea. So you'll see this going back all the way to the, you know, like hundreds of years, maybe 500, 600, 700 years. Do you see this happening across the across the world, essentially? And you'll see this also happening in, unfortunately, in Desi countries as well. The idea of like, you know, if you're darker color and stuff, then you must be inferior or something like that. So they really value people that have like whiter skin and so on, right? So keep these things in mind, that this is sort of like how it sort of spread out. And the United States presidents, the leaders, and like, you know, people that were in various positions of power, their outlook on this didn't really help, right? So for example, one of the things that happened in the time of John F. Kennedy, right? There was a story that I was reading of this person, a diplomat who came from one of the African countries. He came, and you know, because he was a diplomat, he thought that he's going to be treated like, you know, everyone else, because he has a diplomacy status, right? So he came over here, and he tried to get he had some time, so he wanted to go to eat somewhere. So he went to try to eat, and the waiter over there sort of turned him away because he's black, right? Even though he's not like, you know, like a person from America, he was a visiting diplomat from an African country, and so he was sort of turned away. When he was turned away, it really impacted him a lot, right? So this idea started growing in other countries, that you're going around America is going around telling people that they should, they should be a certain way to other, each other and stuff. They need to be like a certain way. They're telling everyone to have democracy and things like that. But at home, they have this hypocrisy where they're not actually applying it with the blacks, right? So this is a very big thing over here. And so this had such a big impact that it started sort of like getting a lot of criticism from around the world, especially African countries. In fact, there was also a statement where Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan had a conversation, and Ronald Reagan at that time, I believe, was the governor of California, and so he was having a conversation with Richard Nixon, and in their conversation, Ronald Reagan mentioned, and there's a recording that was recently revealed, or sort of, like I guess like it became public, but in there, he like Ronald Reagan is having a conversation. He says about there was some success that African countries had with regard to the UN and so on, and so they started like having like I guess like a dance or something like that. They were just like really excited or happy or whatever, and so Ronald Reagan makes a very racist comment, and he says something to the effect that these people have barely just like learned how to wear their shoes, right? And now they're dancing like monkeys. And so this was like something that like later on his daughter, when she heard, I guess she was crying, and she apologized for her dad saying this. But it's really interesting over here because like all this time, if the highest leadership in the world or in the country, right, is perceiving a group of people within their own constituents as inferior like this, and they have this like very racist tendencies, then you can see that it's not going to just disappear overnight, and it's going to have lasting impact until there's a very dynamic shift in like the leadership itself. So that's something that to keep in mind over here. So you see that the Black Lives Movement, it's about 60 years ago. You'll see a lot of things happening with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and you'll see the same thing with Malcolm X and a lot of other leaders that started sort of trying to take rise against all these policies, these racist policies that were being implemented. And at the end of the day, what happens is 60 years go by, and you don't see much difference in terms of the kinds of things that are continuously happening. Although they were happening under the radar, right? A lot of times before the, like smartphones became public access and stuff, right? So what happened is that until that point, they were sort of like, happening in plain sight, but they weren't really being documented in a way where they could actually develop movements behind them, right? And so the Black Lives Movement had this idea, this impact, where now they're starting to expose this kind of stuff. So for the past 60 years, you could say, or more, right? Even though the civil rights era had started, and it was like, had taken a huge it had a lot of goals and ambition, and there was a lot of backing towards with it for it and stuff. And then as it was being progressed forward, there were some policy changes and so on. But at the end of the day, when it came to implementation of those policies and when it came to actual progress, right, you'll see that sort of like it wasn't as much as they had hoped for back then. Even though there was like pretty much millions of people were incited by this, million people were backing this up and stuff, but it sort of like just stayed where it was in the grand scheme of things. So the point that up until today, you have the kind of things that are happening, right? So there's a lot of shootings that happen. There's a lot of killing that happens. There's a lot of this abuse. There's a lot of this unjust policing, right? There's a lot of these kinds of things that have continuously happening. But you also see in the context of disasters that those communities that are predominantly black or people of color, right? These are the communities that are generally more affected by natural disasters. They're originally, or not originally, but like originally relative to like the start of the disasters, right? They're already low income, but when it comes to moving forward, right, when it comes to natural disasters that occur, for example, or in this case the pandemic, what happens is that they get impacted even more, and they sort of have the high, they end up getting more impact in the sense of more damage, more less access to healthcare, less access to benefits and like aid and support, because a lot of people that are more at a higher level, people that are predominantly white communities, for example, or people that are well off more, right? They're able to get access to these kinds of things. But when it comes to these communities, they're consistently stuck in these cycles of poverty because like how are they going to get out when the policies are unfavorable for them? They're not helping them. Also, when people are in these situations, for example, you might find them trying to get access to certain resources so that they can help their families and help themselves develop and progress. But at the end of the day, what happens is that they're not able to qualify for those things, and as a result, they stay stuck in low income jobs or petty crimes, things like that, and so they get stuck in these cycles. And then if they because they're more likely to be targeted by various policing, right? What happens at the end of the day is that they end up getting stuck in the system, and then they get these tags on them that sort of make them unable to, after that, work in any kind of good job, right? So they get this, for example, this label of felony, right? And so when they get this felony charge, or this conviction, and they get stuck in prison, and then they come out of that, now the only place that they can work is something that's going to accept felons, and that's very hard to, there's very few jobs that are going to let you come in as a felon, number one. And number two is that the income that you're going to get is going to be very little, right? And so you get constantly stuck in these kinds of things, and this is sort of how the framework works, and this is how things continue to permeate. And because of that, you'll see like this constant unrest in this community, and that's something that, from our perspective as Muslims, we need to get back. One of the things that I mentioned just a little bit ago, I mentioned about how we should, like, if a person thinks that people are going to be okay and happy and content with being in slavery or under oppression, then that's a fantasy and that's not going to be realistic. And so you need to change your vision and your goals and so on, right? So this is the same idea over here. If we think that people are going to be okay with being oppressed like this, and everything's going against them, then that's just a fantasy and that's not going to be real. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a statement, something to the effect, and I'm not quoting him, but there's something to the effect that these riots are the language of the oppressed, that people revolt or they rebel when they feel overwhelmed by the stresses that are caused by oppression. And so it needs to be understood that, if people's rights are not being given to them, they're going to rebel, they're going to revolt, try to get them back. And it's not something that we should sort of just say, oh, these people are barbaric, or these people are like, they don't know what they're doing and stuff, and we come and try to give them advice on how to navigate situations and stuff, right? Because we can't really relate to them, because they're the ones that are oppressed, and we might even be complicit in terms of our support of the system that makes them oppressed, right? Because if we're not actively trying to change the system, right, we might actually be, and we know that it's wrong, we might be complacent in terms of facilitating the oppression. So it's important to have a stand in these issues as Muslims, but also as human beings, right? And to make sure that we try to make a difference in this arena. So if we don't do that, then this is the kind of impact that happens. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran and in the Prophet and encourages in many places that we're supposed to help the people that are oppressed, and we're supposed to help against the oppressors. So we need to stand up against whoever is oppressing, and we need to, if a person doesn't realize that they're oppressing, then obviously we can educate them. So there's different hows you can navigate. The hows are, there are very many hows. We can customize them based on the context that we're going into, but it is very important to get involved, and it's not good. It's actually harmful if people sit back silently. There's a statement by another person, and he was mentioning in the context of, just like, like a way to get us to think about certain things. And so he mentions, various groups of people, and he said that when they came for this group, then I wasn't part of them, so I didn't say anything. And then when they came for this other group, I wasn't part of them, so I didn't say anything. And this other group, I wasn't part of that group, and so I didn't say anything. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to support me, right? Because everyone was gone, and I was like, I just sort of like stood in my bubble, and I was like, okay, well, it's not me. Okay, so I'm okay. So then it just went one by one until it was my turn, and there was nobody else to support me. So I was the only one left over, and that's the end. And so nobody could help me out. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. We get involved in these processes to make sure that there's a lot of change that brings justice. There's a professor. Her name is Dr. Sylvia. I can't remember her last name, but we had a program with her, and I asked her a question about equity versus equality versus justice and so on. Like, what is the ultimate goal over here? So she was saying that at the end of the day, it all goes back to justice. Because you can use all these words of equity and equality and so on. You can debate them back and forth, but at the end of the day, it's a matter of justice and fairness, right? What is fair? What is just to people? What does the person need? You can sort of pretend that you know what a person needs and sort of try to impose that perspective on the person who actually is in need of something, right? And if it doesn't align with them, then you know that's a problem. But you know, so you don't have a right to say on a person that like you should want this and this, you should need this and this, right? You should go by assessing what their needs are and then navigating according to that. So asking questions or understanding their perspectives and having this communication with them is very effective in terms of understanding what the needs are, right? Um, so that's very important. And a lot of times, the US, for example, the UN, for example, is focusing on trying to develop infrastructure and prioritizing infrastructure in those developing countries. So I didn't get to that inshallah, but I'll get to that next time. Um, the third world countries thing. But I just wanted to sort of like present this idea of how uh, how slavery came to be in the context of the Black community, right? And how it has ramifications that impact not only the Black community but also us. So let me conclude with one thing really quick. The Prophet Allah Subhanahu wa Taala mentions in the Quran that when a group of people, or when the Muslims told the certain group of people to donate and give and spend for the people that were, you know, poor or they needed food and things like that, the people who were being told this, they would say, why should we feed somebody that if Allah Azza wa Jalla had wanted, he would have fed themselves, right? Fed himself. وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله تعالى. They say that, you know, whenever they're told this stuff, they say, should we feed the ones that if Allah had wanted, he would have fed himself? He would have fed them. Why do we have to feed them? So this is the fallacy over here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us, he's tested us to see how we're going to act with our resources. He's given us some resources. He can obviously take care of everything himself, right? But then at the end of the day, he is giving us opportunities to earn our places wherever we want them to be, in Jannah in the hereafter, or in Jahannam. Wherever we want them, we have the opportunity to earn them ourselves, right? We're not gonna be sort of put into various places and stuff like that just because. We have to do our part to demonstrate that we have merit for whatever it is that inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his mercy is going to put us into, right? But if we don't do anything, we just want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to place us in whatever, we might complain later on and say, well, you didn't let me try, right? If I had done it my way, I would have gotten to a higher level. Or maybe I didn't want to go to this higher level. Maybe I wanted to go to this other place, a lower place, right? Why did you make me go over here? So, you know, when it comes to arguments, you can always argue. But at the end of the day, our job over here is to help. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the resources. Nobody can argue there aren't enough resources in the world for, you know, to help everyone else. You know, to everyone, like when it comes to poverty, when it comes to hunger, when it comes to clean water, when it comes to all these things, right? Nobody can argue that there's not enough to go around. There's more than enough to go around. In fact, you know, the northern states, and if you look at some of these links over here that I have over here, you'll see that there is a disparity between the northern countries or the northern areas of the world compared to the southern areas, right? And there's a huge disparity. But just understand over here that like the resources are there. It's just our allocation of the resources that is flawed. So when somebody, for example, questions if Allah is so merciful, why is all there hunger and like why is there all this oppression and stuff going on in the world, right? There's a fallacy in there. There's an assumption that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is supposed to be the one who like fixes everything for us, right? We're just sitting back and we're just like enjoying everything, and Allah is doing all the hard work and all the, like, you know, everything. He has to take care of everything. We do all the bad stuff or whatever, but Allah is responsible for all the mistakes, right? That doesn't make any sense. But the person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not burden a person beyond their capabilities. But then the next part says, for each person is whatever they earned of good, and against every person is whatever they earned of bad. So every person is liable for their own things, right? وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وَزْرَ أُخْرَى. That there is nobody who's going to carry the burden of another person. So we don't inherit sins from our parents, right? We don't have the concept of original sin. For example, if somebody, you know, for example, Adam alayhi salam, he ate from the tree, it doesn't mean that his sin is going to be inherited by his kids. That's not how it works. In Islam, the way it works is that everyone is liable for their own actions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the resources, and he continues to, you know, sustain us and give us more resources. And, you know, the plants are growing still. Aren't plants still growing, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed the system. The sun still comes up. That's a source of energy for us, for all the plants, for us as human beings, right? That's how the life cycle works. That's how air movements work. That's how everything works, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put that, made sure that we have a system so we can figure out what time we need to, like, you know, wake up, for example, what time things are going to happen, how we're going to navigate. We have set maps, we have set like systems for calendar, for example. We have a measure of how to like determine time and so on, right? We have all of these things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitated that for us. He gave us everything. He's continuing to sustain it. The sun is going to keep coming up, right? The wind is going to keep going a certain way. That, you know, the food is going to continue growing and stuff. All these things are happening. That's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he's already put this stuff out there for us, and he continuously maintains them. But when we don't allocate things the right way, when we are doing some things that are not the right way, we don't blame somebody else for our mistakes, for our flaws, for our oppression, right? So there's a fallacy in there, because there's a assumption in that question that you can assign blame to somebody who's not responsible for that blame, for that action, or whatever the situation is. It's like me saying that I go and, like, for example, kill somebody, and I say that, you know, I don't know, like, for example, President Trump needs to go and account for that. He didn't do it, right? Why would he have to go account for my mistakes, for my sin, my oppression, my dhulm? Doesn't make any sense, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not the one responsible for the misappropriation or misallocation of the resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. He's not responsible for the end result, right? Of how we design, like, you know, how we misallocate things, misappropriate things. He's not responsible for us perpetuating oppression, right? He's not responsible for a president, or all the presidents, you know, or many of the presidents who were racist. He's not responsible for their policies. Could he have changed them? Could he have prevented them? Yeah, he definitely could have. But at the same time, then we wouldn't have any claim on Jannah or Jahannam or anything like that, right? We wouldn't have anything to do with anything, because we didn't have any kind of opportunities given to us. We would say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you put Jannah and Jahannam, you put the system of good deeds and bad deeds, but you didn't give us any opportunities to go and, like, you know, implement that system so that we can go towards Jannah and away from Jahannam. But you didn't give us those opportunities, so it's unfair on your part not to give us opportunities. So this understanding over here, understanding, you know, how, like, where the capital T truth is, and where our perceptions of, you know, those things are, meaning our small T truths, and where they misalign, that helps us, you know, easily navigate these contexts. So if a person wants to confuse you, they're going to ask this kind of question: why is there evil, right? When there's such a merciful God? That has nothing to do with it. So there's the fallacy in the question. Likewise, the question of, can God create something? Can God create a rock that he himself cannot lift? There's a fallacy in there which is similar, right? It's assuming that one person who cannot do something can do something, and then that kind of possibility exists, right? That somebody should be able to do something that they cannot do. That if you assume that that's the case, right? So you're assuming that opposites can exist like this in every situation. You're assuming the premise over here, the assumption behind it is that opposites can be equally possible. For example, I can exist and not exist at the same time, right? I can be like hungry and not hungry at the same time. And of course, people might try to, like, go into technicalities. Well, you know, you could be like half full and stuff, whatever. No, I'm going with the underlying premise over here, right? You can be black, like something can be the color black, and at the same time it can be the color white, for example, right? If you want to say that's opposites. You could be, for example, you could be, so you understand what I'm trying to say over here. You know, you could be one thing and not the other thing. You could be praying at the same time that you're not praying. Like, you're in prayer, for example, but you're not in prayer. And that could be a thing. Like, these opposites can exist simultaneously at the same, right? But that is obviously something that we don't agree with, right? That's not a like capital T truth in how the system works. You don't have opposites that are existing at the same time, predominantly, like, in the general scheme of things, right? Somebody might say, well, what about, like, matter and antimatter and stuff and so on? That's not what I'm talking about, because those things themselves are two different things. They're not the same thing, right? Anyways, so I hope that made sense, and I hope that it helps you navigate certain situations that you might be going through. But inshallah, this one right here, the third world countries, we'll go into that next time, inshallah. I know that I went a little bit over now, so I'm gonna stop over here. But I hope this kind of gave you some understanding of the background of um, what's happening in the world today, and also to see like where the fallacies are, where the assumptions are wrong, how to navigate your context in this particular case when it comes to the Black lives and people of color, right? How to navigate that, what are your responsibilities when it comes to this stuff, who gets the blame for what, things like this. I hope that kind of clarifies things a little bit, and you understand why when I said like when things go wrong, why I'm saying that. So step 0 and 1, where that sort of misaligned and why that resulted in negative consequences, and how that permeated throughout time up until today. So with that, if you have any questions, you can ask, and I'll go ahead and conclude now, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا.